So you want to own the most famous ship in the world? Before you picture yourself standing on the bow with your arms out, you need to understand something about the actual business behind the Titanic that gets completely lost in the movie. This was not a single glamorous ship built on a whim. It was one very expensive asset inside a much larger, extremely competitive transatlantic shipping war. And the company that built it was fighting for market share the same way any modern airline fights over premium cabin bookings today. The economics here are genuinely fascinating, right up until the point where they become one of the most sobering stories in maritime history. And we are going to treat that part of this story with the seriousness it deserves. So let's break down what it actually cost to build and operate the Titanic, how the business model behind transatlantic ocean liners actually worked, and what happened both to the ship and to the company that owned it. Let's start with why the ship existed at all. Because the Titanic was not built in isolation. It was built as a competitive weapon. By the early 1900s, the transatlantic passenger trade between Europe and America was a fiercely competitive, genuinely lucrative business. And the White Star Line, the company that owned the Titanic, was locked in an ongoing rivalry with competitors, most notably Cunard Line, over who could offer the fastest, largest, and most luxurious ships crossing the Atlantic. This was, in a very real sense, an arms race, except instead of weapons, the currency was tonnage, speed records, and increasingly opulent first-class accommodations. White Star's strategy under this competitive pressure was to stop chasing pure speed, which Cunard was already winning with ships built for record crossing times, and instead compete on size, stability, and luxury, essentially deciding if they could not win the race, they would win the experience. This is where the Titanic and its two sister ships came in, part of a deliberately planned trio of massive ocean liners meant to dominate the luxury end of the transatlantic market. The initial capital investment here was staggering even by the standards of major industrial projects of the era, requiring purpose-built dry docks and a massively expanded shipyard, specifically to construct vessels of this unprecedented scale. This was not a company dipping a toe into a new market. This was a full-scale, multi-year infrastructure investment, betting heavily on the idea that size and luxury would win over the wealthiest and most frequent transatlantic travelers. Now let's talk about how the actual business model worked, because a transatlantic ocean liner in this era operated on a genuinely clever tiered pricing structure that modern airlines have essentially copied wholesale. First-class tickets were extraordinarily expensive and covered an enormous range of accommodation quality, from comfortable staterooms to genuinely palatial suites that rivaled the finest hotels on land, complete with private promenades, a heated swimming pool, a gymnasium, and multiple restaurants. This tier existed almost entirely to serve the wealthiest travelers of the era, and the ticket prices reflected that, representing sums that could equal a working person's income for an entire year for a single one-way crossing. Second class, while modest compared to first, was still considered notably comfortable and was aimed at the growing middle-class market, professionals, academics, and business travelers who wanted a respectable crossing without first-class luxury pricing. Then, there was third class, often referred to as steerage, which represented the actual volume business behind the entire operation. This tier was aimed squarely at emigrants, traveling to America seeking a new life. And while conditions were far more basic, tickets here were priced to move enormous volume rather than high margin per passenger. This tiered structure meant a single crossing generated revenue from an enormous spread of income levels simultaneously. A small number of extremely high-margin first-class tickets, subsidized partly by, and subsidizing, a very large number of lower-margin steerage tickets, not unlike how a modern airline uses a handful of expensive business-class seats to help cover the cost of running a plane mostly filled with economy passengers. Beyond ticket revenue, these ships also carried substantial cargo and mail contracts, since a vessel this size crossing the Atlantic regularly represented valuable capacity for shipping goods and, critically, official mail contracts with the British government, which came with their own dedicated payments and were a meaningful, steady revenue stream layered on top of passenger fares. Let's talk about the actual construction side of this business for a moment, because building a ship this size was its own enormous economic undertaking before it ever generated a single dollar of ticket revenue. The Titanic was built by Harland and Wolff, a Belfast shipbuilding firm that had a long-standing, almost exclusive relationship with White Star Line, essentially functioning as White Star's dedicated construction arm, rather than an outside contractor bidding competitively for the work. This arrangement meant White Star could plan enormous, multi-year construction projects with a shipyard it trusted completely. But it also meant Harland and Wolff had to continuously expand its own physical capacity to keep pace with White Star's increasingly ambitious ships, including building an entirely new, purpose-built gantry and slipway specifically sized for vessels of this unprecedented scale. Thousands of workers were employed directly on the physical construction: riveters, platers, engineers, and carpenters, representing years of sustained labor cost before the ship ever touched water. And this kind of infrastructure investment meant the shipbuilder and the ship owner were, in effect, financially intertwined in a way that made both companies deeply dependent on this class of ship succeeding commercially. Once built, actually running the ship required a genuinely enormous and highly stratified workforce. And understanding this crew structure tells you a lot about how a ship this size actually functioned as a small floating economy of its own. At the top sat the ship's officers, responsible for navigation and command, a relatively small but highly paid group, given their expertise and responsibility. Below them, engineering staff kept the propulsion system running, and this included one of the most brutal jobs in the entire operation: the firemen and trimmers who worked in the boiler rooms, shoveling coal into furnaces in extreme heat for hours at a stretch. A physically punishing role that existed on essentially every large steamship of the era and represented a substantial portion of the total crew simply because of how labor-intensive coal power actually was. Above deck, an entirely different tier of staff, stewards, stewardesses, kitchen staff, and a live orchestra existed purely to service the first and second class experience, since the luxury brand White Star was selling depended entirely on impeccable, hotel-quality service being available around the clock. This meant a single voyage's payroll spanned an enormous range, from officers earning respectable professional wages down to stewards and firemen earning considerably less for genuinely demanding labor, all coexisting on the same vessel simultaneously. Operating costs for a ship this size were enormous and constant. Coal to power, the engines represented a massive ongoing expense, requiring a large dedicated crew of firemen and trimmers working in genuinely brutal conditions simply to keep the boilers fed around the clock. Crew wages across every department, from officers and engineers down to stewards, kitchen staff, and musicians, added up to a substantial payroll for a single voyage, and maintaining a ship of this scale between crossings, hull maintenance, engine servicing, refitting luxury interiors as tastes changed, represented a continuous drain on capital that never really stopped. Insurance was another major and unavoidable cost. A vessel representing this much capital investment, carrying this many passengers and this much cargo, required substantial marine insurance coverage, and the premiums on an asset this valuable were a serious ongoing business expense long before anything ever went wrong. So, on paper, assuming everything went according to plan, this was a genuinely sound, if capital-intensive, business model. Tiered pricing that captured revenue across the entire market, steady mail contracts, cargo capacity, and a brand reputation for luxury that could command premium first-class pricing indefinitely. Now we need to talk about what actually happened, and this is a moment in the story where the tone of this video needs to change, because this is not a business setback. It was a genuine human tragedy, and it deserves to be discussed as one. On its maiden voyage in April 1912, the Titanic struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic and sank, resulting in the deaths of more than 1,500 people, the majority of the passengers and crew aboard. The ship did not carry enough lifeboats for everyone on board, a decision shaped by outdated safety regulations that had not kept pace with how large ships had become, and evacuation procedures were badly hampered by confusion, delayed communication, and the sheer scale of the unfolding disaster. This was an enormous, genuinely devastating loss of life, and it remains one of the most significant maritime disasters in modern history for good reason. The disaster prompted major and lasting changes to maritime safety law internationally, including new requirements for sufficient lifeboat capacity for everyone aboard a vessel, mandatory 24-hour radio watch on passenger ships, and the establishment of an international ice patrol to monitor iceberg hazards in shipping lanes. Reforms that fundamentally reshaped maritime safety standards going forward and likely saved countless lives on ships built in the decades that followed. Now, returning to the business side of the story, because the sinking had real and lasting consequences for the company itself, which is worth understanding as part of the full picture. White Star Line survived the immediate disaster as a company, but the reputational damage was severe and lasting. The brand that had been built specifically around size, luxury, and implied safety through scale took a significant hit, and the company faced numerous lawsuits and claims from victims' families and survivors in the aftermath. A substantial and prolonged legal and financial burden layered on top of the loss of one of its flagship vessels. Formal inquiries were convened on both sides of the Atlantic, in Britain and the United States, examining exactly what had gone wrong, from the ship's speed through known ice fields to the lifeboat shortage to the conduct of the crew during evacuation. And these investigations themselves represented a significant undertaking, generating extensive public testimony and, ultimately, the regulatory changes that reshaped the entire industry going forward. It's also worth understanding what happened to the rest of this specific class of ship, because the Titanic's story is sometimes told in isolation when it was actually part of a planned trio. Its sister ship, the Olympic, had already been in service before the Titanic's maiden voyage and continued operating commercially for White Star for roughly 2 more decades afterward, undergoing significant retrofitting to meet the new lifeboat and safety requirements that emerged directly from the disaster, essentially becoming a floating example of the industry, adapting in real time to the very tragedy its sister ship had suffered. The third vessel in the trio, originally planned under a different name, was redesigned before completion, specifically to incorporate lessons learned from the sinking, additional watertight compartment improvements, and expanded lifeboat capacity chief among them, before eventually entering service as a hospital ship during the First World War, rather than the luxury liner originally envisioned. And it was ultimately lost to a wartime mine, rather than ever completing a peacetime transatlantic crossing as intended. The broader competitive position White Star had been building toward, dominance in the luxury transatlantic market through its trio of massive liners, was permanently altered by the disaster, and the company's later corporate history involved genuine financial struggles through the 1920s and 1930s, culminating in an eventual merger with its longtime rival Cunard in the following decades. A genuinely striking outcome given the two companies had spent years locked in fierce, expensive competition, specifically over which of them could build the grander ship. Let's put the full financial picture together. On the cost side, you had an enormous upfront infrastructure and construction investment, ongoing coal and crew costs for every single crossing, continuous maintenance to preserve the luxury standard the brand depended on, and substantial insurance premiums reflecting the sheer value of the asset itself. On the revenue side, you had a genuinely clever tiered pricing model that captured value from the wealthiest travelers in the world, down to emigrants seeking passage to a new life, supplemented by steady mail contracts and cargo revenue, all built around a brand promise of size, luxury, and safety that the company had spent years and enormous capital carefully constructing. So does the transatlantic ocean liner business model actually work? As a purely financial venture, the tiered pricing structure was genuinely sound and profitable when it functioned as designed, and the broader industry continued operating successfully on the same model for decades afterward. But this specific ship's story is also a stark reminder that no business model, however cleverly designed, can outrun the real-world consequences of the safety decisions built into the product itself, and no ledger can properly account for the actual human cost when those decisions go wrong. So if you're still asking whether you should own a transatlantic ocean liner company, the honest answer is this. The tiered pricing model behind ships like this was a genuinely smart piece of business design, one that modern airlines still essentially copy today. But the story of the Titanic specifically is remembered correctly, not for its business model at all, but for the more than 1,500 lives lost, and for the safety reforms that came only after the fact. A reminder that some costs in this business were never going to show up on any balance sheet until it was far too late.